So who do you want to blame for the housing boom and bust? Terrific book here by Tom Sowell, who I've been reading since the 1980s. When I got to college, I was flirting with Marxism. And Tom Sowell used to be really interested in Marxism. He wrote a very fair-minded book on Karl Marx and his philosophy and economics. And I read it while I was a Marxist and thought it out really well and it was fair. And so whether I was a Marxist or came to loathe Marxism or communism, my respect for the book didn't change. And I went on to read a dozen of Tom Sowell's books. And last one I bought was this for 2009, The Housing Boom and Bust. So was it greedy bureaucrats that caused the housing bust, or was it greedy Wall Street people, greedy bankers, or was it bureaucrats greedy for power? Was it government or capitalist greed that caused this housing boom? And let's say it's greed. Well, what can the government do to regulate human emotions? There's nothing the government can do to regulate lust and greed directly, or love or hate or these human emotions. So Tom Sowell says it's the government that caused the bust, the people who forced directly to make bad loans under the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act and the other legislation that followed it. Okay, it's not the majority of people who lend who conform to this CRA, Community Reinvestment Act, but about a decade ago there was a quote-unquote voluntary agreement by pretty much all lenders not covered by the CRA to in effect follow the same guidelines. The threat was if they didn't, they'd be prosecuted for discrimination by the Clinton administration. This prosecution would be imposed if you were a lender and say you refused to lend to a house worth less than $60,000. Why? Because low-income minorities are more likely to buy this kind of house, therefore there'd be a disparate impact which equals discrimination, which the government declares illegal. So how can anyone measure greed? For a century, the mortgage market was the most reliable market around. So were people not greedy 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago in the mortgage market? Of course, the emotions didn't change. So there's a history of the government intervening in the housing market, particularly the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They imposed quotas on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy up mortgages that the original lenders made to people who were low-income minorities or other criteria. So Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they bought $1.7 trillion worth of these high-risk mortgages. And now the government's had to spend well over $100 billion to bail out Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac with no end in sight. See, the government has life and death power in the United States over its lending institutions. The ordinary business decisions that companies can make in the free market, many of these decisions cannot be made without government approval in the U.S. lending market. They can hold up your business at their discretion. The heart of the mortgage meltdown is that mortgage loans were made to people who had a low probability of paying them back, says Tom Sowell. As long as people were paying back their mortgage loans, there was no crisis. So you can't even blame the crisis on the ratings agencies. There was no evidence out there. The problem was no one knew how risky these new devices, the subprime loans, the no money down loans. No one knew how risky there was. There was no reasonable way to rate them. The law required them to be rated. Law also specified that 3 agencies had the sole power to rate them for the purposes of SEC regulation. So they had to rate them. They gave them the best bet. So, Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, for many years it didn't make any difference. What set it off was there are some studies, I think in the early 90s, suggesting that banks were discriminating against blacks and other minorities. This set off a political crusade, got a government inquisition on lenders. They were forced to make loans that they did not want to make. So it was a 1980 savings and loan crisis caused by deregulation. In part, it's a combination of deregulation, the government guaranteeing these organizations without putting restrictions on how they did business, which is essentially what they've done with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. everyone assumed that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would be bailed out by the US Treasury, which is just what happened. So remember, the mortgage market for about a century was one of the safest markets around. It's where the widows and orphans would put their money so they'd have something to live on. So it's not like commodity speculation. For all these decades, greed didn't have a bad effect. Only had a bad effect when the politicians stepped in and started forcing lenders to lend money to people they didn't want to lend to. Now we've got people like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd and all the others who created the problem, and they're railing on Wall Street. They're railing about Wall Street and about bankers.